Sometimes the riot is a quiet one, where the battle is to love yourself and function in society, where voices of reason are muted by anxiety, like gaining notoriety is selling your soul. So we tend to go no deeper than the shallow water level, trying to keep us overhead in the face of all the slurs and the stares. Mentally frozen, paralyzed by fear of failure and success. So we lock, stock, barrel, running while it's crumbling. All these towers and that babbling, but the baby's in the bath and the stash under the bed on my head, spinning from the circles and the puppets and the strings that they pull. Then we move. Reactionary warfare never produces winners on the field. Feeble and foolish, what tools and what weapons are we using? We need some new ones. Real revolution, it's real solutions. What we've taken on the ways of the ones who conquer with their guns and religion and division. Got my inner me looking like my enemy. Real revolution, where my inner me really a mirror for the galaxy. New time, brand new paradigms, new contracts to sign. They thought that this would all be televised, though it's happening right before our very eyes. It's on the inside, with their guns cocked. When that rock drops, standing on the rooftop, praying that the mountaintop can live inside the valley. People tell me the reward is somewhere off in heaven, like heaven's only in the sky, like chariots are swinging, like God is something separate from yourself, from your wealth, from your lover, from your neighbor. Oh, your savior is coming in your own name, coming with the face the same. Real revolution, it's real solutions, where we've taken on the ways of the ones who conquer with their guns and religion and division. Got my inner me looking like my enemy. Real revolution, where my enemy is really a mirror for the galaxy. And so we lock, stock, barrel, running while it's crumbling. All these towers and they're babbling, but the baby's in the bath and the stash under the bed. Oh, my head spinning from the circles and the puppets and the strings they pull. Then we move. Reactionary warfare never produces winners on the field. Feeble and foolish, what tools and what weapons are we using? We need some new ones. It's real revolution, producing real solutions, because we've taken on the ways of the ones who conquer with their guns and religion and division.
Going on, good people. We are live and direct. That is Sonny Patterson. I am Kalonji Changa, and you could tell I haven't been on the boards in a while. Dr. Joy James, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Can you hear me?
I hear you well. You're in the building.
Thanks for that beautiful offering. It's a gift, like our, the folks that are going to speaking with us soon. But Sonny Patterson always has the moment and reads it correctly. So thanks for opening with that art.
No doubt, no doubt. Very necessary for folks who are in Atlanta. This Saturday, Sonny Patterson will actually be live. She will be here in Atlanta performing at the Malcolm X Festival. So make sure, if you are available, check it out. Come through Atlanta. This is a free joint. Sonny Patterson, she won't let you down. That's our Poet Laureate. That's the official song for, well, not that particular song, but Pretty Fall is the official song for RSTV. And I'm going to go for a vote and say that Real Revolution be the official song for GIU. What you think, Dr. James?
It works.
Okay, that's all we need. That's all we need. It's official. It's official. Anyway, this is Guerrilla Intellectual University, and we haven't done a GIU in a long time.
I think the last time we did one was when we were talking about Mumi Abu-Jamal, the health conditions, right? And that ended up being transcribed. And so you have a lot of beauty behind you, a lot of art today. C. Flux Sings art on the cover of Beyond Cop Cities. So I think there's a lot that can be shared with our listeners, viewers, in conversation with Dr. Mohamed Abdou and also with Ashanti Alston.
Listen, you mentioned Behind Cop City. Since you mentioned it, and since it's like right behind me, give the folks a little bit of info on what Beyond Cop Cities is, because some people are watching. They like, what they talking about? What's Beyond Cop Cities? You know what
Yeah,
I mean? So
yeah.
give it
I
to us.
said behind, but it's really beyond. But the Beyond Cop Cities is behind you. That is correct. And actually, it weaves together our analyses. It's collective analyses focusing on organizers, but also Tortuguita's mother, who you interviewed, Belkes Turan, who's talking about spirituality. And actually, our guests today are deeply embedded in spirituality, but also, however we define revolution, moving forward out of a kind of stagnant culture that we are grappling with now in the United States. But this small book is a collective endeavor. It addresses violent policing, militarized policing, the fact that police in the New York City train with the IDF, and we understand how violent and militaristic the IDF is. So if there's a convergence of those two entities, then we understand what our future will look like, unless we can actually destabilize the growing militarization of police. And there are actually references in the beginning and the closing parts of the text that address the issue of genocide in Palestine.
No doubt, no doubt. So Beyond Cop Cities, make sure you check it out. The title is Beyond Cop Cities: Dismantling State and Corporate Funded Armies and Prisons. Okay, there was actually a murder here in Atlanta yesterday. Young brother, shout out to my son Cash, a friend of his, by the name of Reginald Folks, was murdered by he was actually a Lyft driver, and he was murdered in his own car by an Atlanta police officer who, according to him, this Atlanta cop was on suspension for uh, having controlled substance in another town, another city here in Georgia, in Milton, Georgia. The cop's name is Kobe Minor. He was on suspension since December 25th when he was stopped and had about 20 Xanax on him. He claims he shot this young brother inside of this lift because, according to him, he said that he heard a voice in his ear, and he said that he asked the Lyft driver to stop the car. He wouldn't stop the car, and so he said that he thought that the Lyft driver was kidnapping him and trying to recruit him into a gay fraternity. This is the official narrative from the police officer. So he shot this young man and killed him, shot him in cold blood. So he's arrested, and he's since resigned. So say, the world is as nutty as anyway.
But yeah, I mean, there's the convergence here, and actually, it ties into our conversation. I know we're going to move on because people are waiting to hear from our guests. But Islam and Anarchism, Mohamed Abdou's book. So there's all this repression, and there's also obviously issues around health, mental health, and just aggravated, escalating violence. But the targets tend to routinely be, at least in these spectacular, killings and murders, people of color, LGBTQ, trans folks, people who come out of the military and who've been traumatized by being in war, and then see everything as warfare when they return to the States. And unfortunately, they enroll or they become employed in these local police precincts or police entities, which just gives you pension and a paycheck to dysregulate in unspeakable violence. So our prayers to their family of the Lyft driver, and also to the community that must be incredibly distressed by this loss and this tragedy.
doubt, and you hit it right on the nail because the officer is actually an ex-marine.
Uh,
Um, for folks who check out our platform, I just interviewed his former supervisor last night. His former supervisor is one of my comrades. He was actually um, a security officer before he became a Atlanta PD, and he talks about this guy's character in this last interview. So make sure you check out that particular interview. You're checking out Black Power Media for folks who are new to the platform. I can see there's a lot of folks that are watching on Twitter. We appreciate you. If you could hop on to YouTube and subscribe, it's youtube.com/ at Black Power Media Reloaded, youtube.com/ Black Power Media Reloaded, at Black Power Media Reloaded, and it's at the bottom of the screen. What I'm going to do, because we have two guests and we're pressed for time, I know you mentioned Mohamed Abdou, but before we bring Mohamed on, I want to bring on one of his mentors, one of our joint mentors, who is no stranger to this platform, who is no stranger to organizing or freedom fighting or any of this type stuff. And I think that he's a brother that I can say has inspired me for many years. I appreciate the books. He hasn't sent me any books in the mail lately. Hint, hint. But I'm looking in the mailbox. Anyway, I want to bring on brother, veteran Panther and BLA fighter Ashanti Alston. What's happening, Ashanti? How you doing?
are you on mute?
Oh, all right, my brother. Thank you for putting me on the spot like that. I'm gonna have some books for you, man. I'm gonna have some books for you. Don't worry about it. I got them. Joy, it's a pleasure to see you
Don't let him
again.
press you.
Thank y'all for having us on.
No doubt, no doubt. So hey, we Dr. Mohamed Abdou. I know that when I was talking to Mohamed was like, Ashanti's one of my mentors, so on and so forth. So if you don't mind, give us a few words on who Mohamed Abdou is to you, and before we bring him on to rock with us today.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, we actually 20 years now, and sometimes I got to really think about that. Like we've known each other that long. And he was in Canada. Um, and he was even then, he was making this connection between Islam and anarchism, like pulling from Islam what the anti-authoritarian concepts that could actually come out of it, you know. And I think the thing that I've always admired about him, even when he was in Canada, when he was in school in Canada, he was still involved, more deeply involved with struggles going on in Canada, especially in Canada with Indigenous folks and other issues in Canada. So he's always made that that combination between you know organizing and the intellectual things that are necessary to understand and to be able to enhance practices around them struggles. Um, and then here we are years later, that book finally comes out. And I'm really proud of him because he's been really consistent. He's been back and forth from Canada to the United States to Egypt, all in the midst of catching a lot of hell, because of the politics of his books and because of the steadfastness of his practice, hold to his principles. So he's been this still young man compared to me, that I'm very proud that he's gotten to this point that even with Colombia and other forces still trying to knock him down, he's still pushing forward.
Right on, right on, right on. We appreciate that for sure. That's Ashanti Alston, and we have a serious interview we did with him in the past, and we're looking forward to bringing Ashanti back on to talk about more things in depth when it comes to the Black Liberation Army in particular. Um, Quick intro: Dr. Mohamed Abdou is a North African Egyptian Muslim anarchist, interdisciplinary activist, scholar of indigenous, Black, critical race and Islamic studies, as well as gender, sexuality, abolition, decolonization, with extensive fieldwork experience in the Middle East, North Africa, Asia, and Turtle Island. This year, he is Archipeda visiting assistant professor of Middle Eastern South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. He's a former assistant professor of sociology at the American University of Cairo and recently completed his postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University. I'm going to bring Dr. Mohamed Abdou on in his new book, Islam and Anarchism, in the building.
Yeah.
Dr. Amadou, what's happening? I mean, Dr. Abdou, what's happening with you?
Assalamu alaikum,
Wa alaikum salam.
Dr. James, Ashanti. It's an honor to be with you all. And Ashanti, immense gratitude for the kind and generous introduction. You've been my elder for 20 years when we first met at Blue Stocking. I'll never forget. Joy, it is an incredible honor to be with you today. I know we've corresponded for quite some time. And Kalonji, thank you very much for just bringing us together as well.
Right on. Right on. Well, for folks who are unfamiliar with what's going on, Ashanti alluded to the fact that you've been catching a lot of hell, and I guess that's a understatement. But we know that you've had all types of situations going on, from death threats to folks trying to whitelist you, or what they call blacklisting. They've been coming at you pretty hard. Folks who are unfamiliar, we know that you've been on the scene over at Columbia. Your tweets have been gangster. They've been like tight buys on them. They've been feeling it. It's like bullet searing, and they've taken your tweets to Congress to talk about this terrible Mohamed Abdou and how he's just a menace to society, and he's just pro Palestinian and anti-Zionist, which I don't see anything wrong with. But I want to know, for folks who are not following, give us a little bit of background as to why you would be targeted, because there's a whole lot of professors and a whole lot of students that are being attacked around the country and around the globe right now. So within this state of tyranny and oppression, within this most violent, under this violent regime, why are you so special?
First off, again, assalamu alaikum and shalom alachaim to our Jewish siblings who might be listening. I usually start anything that I often say out in public with Moses' prayer in the Quran. And Moses' prayer is Allahumma shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma shrah li sadri, O Creator, open thy breast, wa yassir li amri, and make my affairs easy. Wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli, and undo the knot in my tongue, such that what it is that I have to share with you all, the broader audience, reaches you all. Again, it's an honor to be with you all. There are many ways in which one can talk about how this all evolved. If you want to ask me, the reason that I'm being targeted to put it directly is because I'm casting doubt on the American dream. I'm calling it out for what it is that Malcolm had referred to it as an American nightmare. I'm calling attention to 1492 and what happened to Muslims and Jews in Andalusia and Spain in terms of forced conversion, persecution, murder. The reference to as savages and heathens, savage being the racial sort of descriptor and heathen being the religious. And obviously underneath the auspices of Ferdinand and Isabel. But also how that links to Columbus's invasion of the Americas. Manifest Destiny, Doctrines of Discovery, Terra Nullius. Indigenous people were referred to as savages and heathens. Hernan Cortez had referred to Aztec women as Moorish women, Aztec temples, the 400 of them, as Moorish mosques. He referred to Montezuma, the Aztec leader, as a sultan. Even the term Berdach that was used to describe two-spirit indigenous people was first cast upon gender non-conforming Muslims. And then, of course, with settler colonialism here, the very monster, 31 years of ongoing genocide here. That continued, and that project continued after the murder of over 100 million indigenous people with transatlantic slavery, with the Middle Passage, like the slavery projects, as Saadia Hartman had referred to it, stand your ground laws, school to prison pipelines. But the third and fifth of Our Black siblings were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa. So I'm talking about how America is a crusading project that continues on to this day. Of course, the white man, having appropriated Christianity and Eastern tradition, weaponized it underneath Constantine as an imperial instrument of conquest. That's why I'm being outed, because I'm saying that we don't only have a genocide insofar as Palestine, but ultimately that the genocide continues here. And we need to contend with that. The wisdom of the serpent snake, as Frederick Douglass had referred to her, America. And with the monstrosity that particularly, and here I'm calling out immigrants and immigrant settlers of color. Of course, Indigenous people are the caretakers of the land, and Black people who are descendants of the Middle Passage, I don't consider them to be settlers. And this is a discussion that we ostensibly have to sit down and talk about, because there wasn't the element of choice. But here I'm referring to immigrant settlers of color. So I'm talking about Southwest Asians or South Asians, North Africans, Arabs, Muslims, and so on, that buy into the American dream, upward ascendancy, mobility, civilizationism, assimilation into the settler colonial society, the structure that this is. Because as Patrick Wolf had referred to, settler colonialism is 1492 is not an event. It set up a structure. And we need to understand that structure, because as Kwame Ture had noted, that there is a difference between mobilization and organization. Organization is about understanding structures, and perhaps this is something that we'll talk about. But the fact is, we should be able to live in a world together where our faith or our lack of faith, and despite of them, that we can have dialogues across our differences, if not for ourselves or the sake of Mother Earth, but for the sake of our children, who, as Mumi Abu Jamal had noted, come from immortality and are the arrows that we shoot towards infinity. But of course, that isn't being permitted, that isn't being allowed, because the architects of animosity, be it Shafiq Manouche, be it, Congresswomen Stefanik, or Congress in general, be it Genocide Joe, be it Trump, be it, the media, the mainstream media, whether it's Fox News, liberal, conservative, CNN, and so on and so forth, amplify in hyperbolic ways the animosities or the differences that exist, just to create schisms between us. But yeah, for these reasons, and I'll stop there, that I became a target, and I'll go back. It's because I'm casting doubt on the American dream, and not just calling out the genocide that Israel is certainly complicit in, and Zionists are complicit in.
Right on. Joy, you had something you wanted to?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I believe in the introduction of your book, which is actually brilliant. So thank you for the gift, right? That this whole American project has been poisonous. I mean, I'm not saying those are your words, but that's how I'm going to paraphrase it here. And then it's as if the pundits and some of the professors who become the presidents of these universities, even though they don't present as being reactionaries, such as Stefanik, right, who also has this whole narrative appended to her about relationships with anti-Semitic constructs, right? The replacement theory, you will not replace, like, who are you talking about right now? Oh, and so there's this weird alliance. Maybe it's not weird because it's an alliance of reactionaries, but you would think that Shafiq is Egyptian, I believe, right? This is the president of Columbia University. This whole integrationist project is really an integration into empire. This is the way that I'm reading you, and this is the way that I'm understanding you. And so linked to it is a desire to belong. So it suggests to me that people would just lie their tongues off in order to be embedded in an imperial project. And so what you're doing, what the students are doing, and the professors who support them, as well as other activists and organizers, is very brave and courageous. And it's also deeply spiritual. So this is when I read you and I hear you, because I've seen you on Red Nation, and people should go online so that they can have other perspectives about the narrative that you're sharing as basically imperative. That, you know, from 1492, if you want to start with that date when I believe the Arabs and Africans were defeated in Spain and pushed out, the so-called Moors, right, to the present day, we've been doing this barbaric dance, like this forced dance, you know, by the piper, which is capital and imperialism. And so many people who look like us appear to have agreed to go along with the tune.
No, you're absolutely right, Dr. James. The key component here, and this is part of what I say, whiteness isn't a color, just a color of skin, right? Albeit it says it is that, right? It's a phenotype, it's a privilege. I mean, hell, people of color, we've been tamed, we've been weaned to resent our own color of skin. I mean, we'll bleach our skin white. This is the degree of internal resentment that we've cultivated. Shame, what Fanon had referred to as the inferiority complex, right? Black skin, white masks. So what I prefer to focus on is, you know, it's nobody's fault that they're born sort of white and there are Arabs that are white passing and all that, right? And that's fine and all. Whiteness is sort of it's a certain power, it's a certain complicity, it's a certain privilege because of the structures that it's embodied within. But this is why I prefer to focus on cultures of whiteness, which even BIPOC people have internalized. And what our acronyms is BIPOC, if we have Black, Indigenous people, Black people of color, LGBTIQ, but that's the governing order that the white man had handed us over for us to conceptualize, perceive of ourselves, and to make ourselves perceptible to one another, even as people of color. But I mean, people of color have internalized cultures of whiteness, right? And this becomes part of the problem. You know, this is why Fanon called it black skin, white masks, right? And brown skin, white masks, and we can talk about red skin, white masks. So Manu Shafi is sort of an embodiment of that assimilationist project, precisely as you noted. 1492 becomes very important because of the spiritual arc, because of the presumption of secularism that masks its Christian ethos, or its white Christian ethos, let us put it that way, right? Like, again, Protestant conceptualizations of property that this nation is founded, Victorian notions of gender and sexuality, manifest destiny, as I mentioned, doctrines of discovery, terra nullius. And the left having become so antagonistic to this question of spirituality. And of course, we'd have to talk about the difference between spirituality and faith and religion, because these are three, at least in Islam, three interrelated concepts, but they're not one and the same thing. We'd have to talk about between authoritarian and non-authoritarian and non-institutionalized conceptualizations of religion. So this is what becomes key. But 1492, I mean, in the works of the great Sylvia Wynter, Ila Shuhat, Salman Sayed, a lot, it figures into the equation that way. And the way that leftists embody this anti-spiritual aspect, well, we'd have to rethink that, because as Kwame Ture had noted, you know, you can't be revolutionary without being religious. And then we have the examples of Nat Turner, we have the examples of Malcolm, of MLK, and so many others, right? That are embodiment of a political, theological, social justice project that, in my humble opinion, is founded in all faiths. Whereas Jesus that stood beside Mary Magdalene, right? That flipped the table on the money exchangers in the temples. Where's Muhammad who stood for the oppressed? Where's Moses who stood before and fought against Pharaoh? This becomes the question, right? And there is no, you know, Puritanism here, in the sense that, look, I mean, Myanmar and the government there has constructed a militarized conservative interpretation of Buddhism to use against the Rohingya, right? And Islamophobia is this linchpin that everybody from China uses against the Uyghur, and this and certainly in the case of Hindu Tava against Dalits, Kashmiris, and so on, right? And Malayali people who are Christian are lumped underneath that umbrella. It's not that Islam is exceptional to me, but it's become the quintessential other, which has been constructed as the quintessential other, given that history of 1492, and the battle or the war against Christendom. And what Islam has come to figure in the mind of the white crusader, especially when we're talking about indigenous land defenders and water protectors, being referred to as jihadi terrorists by paramilitary organizations as Tiger Squad, right, that are extension of the military-industrial complex insofar as the US, or even Black Lives Matter protesters being labeled as Black extremist groups. So this becomes the figuration of Islam, that one can't really contend with race or understand it without understanding spirituality and religion and the way that intersects historically. and the way that both impact one another in terms of racial projects, but also the religious animus that informs that component. So yeah, that becomes the key. And in my mind, I'm not going to have to choose between the false binary between a Zionist crusading Wahhabi project on the one hand and a Russian Chinese totalitarian project on the other hand. Those are false choices to me. Do people of color not have alternative forms of governance that beyond the white man's nation state? The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, as Audrey had taught us. We see capitalism as sort of a product of colonial modernity, but what about the nation state, right? And here we also need to distinguish between, because this is what Stefanik, white supremacists were, supporting just a few years ago, Jews will not replace us kind of narratives, right? In Charleston. I mean, this is the facade of it all, right? And all of a sudden they care about Jewish people, Trump and the alt-right and so on. But liberalism being the bosom of white supremacy, that's part of it, and enlightenment and politics and so on and so forth. But the key thing here is that I'm trying to also transcend neoconservative interpretations of this Islam, because what I'm saying is that, hey, I'm with and for anti-colonial resistance. I'm with the arc of resistance. However, I got issues with the resistance. I got issues with Hamas. I got issues with Hezbollah. I got issues with any movement or any state, for that matter, that embodies authoritarian, that embodies, sexist, racist, misogynist, queerphobic sort of tendencies. And that isn't just exclusive to, perhaps, Hamas or Hezbollah, just to name, right? Or Ansarullah or whatever. But these ills exist on the left. I mean, that embodies queerphobia, that embodies, anti-blackness, and a lot of other things. And they exist, of course, on the right. So, but that's the idea behind Islam and anarchism and using the Quran, because whether you're part of the Nation of Islam, whether you're Sunni, whether you're Shiite, I don't identify with any of these sects, right? That ultimately you're beholden to the Quran, right? It becomes the barometer by which I'm able to gauge. And I ask myself, and not to compare myself, in any way, I mean, he's our shining black prince that way, but Malcolm, what would, because the beauty about Malcolm is that he always engaged in these projects of metamorphosis. The Malcolm before and after the Nation of Islam is not the same as the Malcolm before and after. What would Malcolm say about his friendship with regards to a queer black man, James Baldwin? How would that have led him insofar as his understanding of queerness?
But didn't he love Baldwin, or Baldwin love Malcolm? I mean, see, this is why I so appreciate your work, because there's a fluidity, and I know there's a lot going on, but that's how flow goes. There's always a lot in the flow, right? But to concretize with Malcolm, and maybe I step back and I'll just talk about Baldwin. He becomes a survivor of these siblings, right? And everybody knows Baldwin is queer, and they also know they're brilliant. And they also know Baldwin is I can't live in this country anymore. So Baldwin is going to do like a Nina Simone. I'm in France, right? I would rather not be in the American project, but I'm going to write and critique it. So I think of Medgar Evers, assassinated in 1963, Malcolm's assassinated in 1965. His daughters were working with Ben Crump to sue the NYPD, FBI, CIA, implicating them in that assassination. And then King is assassinated in 1968, right? So that, and there's Sam Cooke is in the mix too, right? There's a way in which these men all loved each other, and in ways that if we were isolated, this one's got to be banned because of his politics, which would be like Malcolm, or this one has to be banned because of their sexuality, which would be Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro, kind of documentary that doesn't mention that Baldwin is queer, if I recall that documentary, and I watched it several times. So my question to you, and I'm sorry if I feel like I'm hogging it, but this is really setting my brain on fire. Why is it, or how could it be that we could more clearly see our vulnerability, but also our strength and resistance, if we agreed not to engage in what Felicia Denal described as Western fundamentalism? That there is a reactionary proto-fascist religiosity in the United States. They just secularized it, and they sprinkle stardust from billionaires on top of it and pretend like it's not what it is, which is something that is incredibly poisonous. So, how is it that our relationship with liberalism, with the desire to belong, with the desire to be safe, can be disrupted and stabilized by spirituality at the same time?
Thank you for that question, Joy. I think it comes from, or I think contending with your question means that we need to transition from talking about resistance, I think, to talk about liberation. Resistance to me is reactionary, liberation is active. We keep on talking about surviving, but what about thriving, which is an active stance? Because I think in so many different ways, I mean, and I think this was, again, going back to Fanon, that when the colonized other sees an image of themselves, or as we have been exposed to colonialism over the course of, again, 531 years, we develop these reactionary stances. Part of it is a religious component in terms of how we tend to see our relationship to spirituality. One can look at it insofar as Algeria, for instance, with the FLN. Women were very much a part of the resistance against the French. And they weren't necessarily hijabis or anything like that. And once you overthrow your colonizer, because you want to distance yourself from anything remotely associated with whiteness, and because you're just acting in reactionary self-defense formations, you're not even allowed the ability to reconfigure your own traditions, to understand what the colonizer had done in relationship to you, in relationship to land, because the question also goes back to land. Land configures everything, not only our spirituality, because she is a spiritual subject, right? She's not an object. But it configures time, space, gender relations, the private, the public. And so to take a step back and to be able to rethink. But what happened in the case of Algeria is the fact that a lot of men turned to conservative interpretations of Islam and said, okay, well, we want to distance from anything remotely white. And you women, you go back home, you wear your hijabs, and in a certain sense, that is part of the formulation that led to the quote-unquote the civil war. I don't consider it to be much of a civil war. I don't think there are many civil wars as much as they are proxy wars that way. But this is sort of the reactions. We can look at it in examples as Daesh, as ISIS, which is a reactionary movement, albeit extreme, supported by the West and certainly Zionists and Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism and so on and so forth. In terms of what would make hundreds of thousands of Muslims, and we're talking about 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds that left their homes in the UK. They'd never lived in Iraq or in Syria. But ISIS had broke that arbitrary dividing, colonizing sort of boundary, geography between Iraq and Syria, right? That arbitrary border that, colonialism had drawn. And these 14, 15-year-olds went, and they wanted to be a part of the Ummah, or the conceptualization of the Ummah, which is sort of the community of Muslims, I would argue, and believers generally together, alike. At least that's its traditional understandings insofar as what the Prophet Muhammad founded, a community of Muslims, Jews, Christians, Sabians, Zoroastrians, all who were unified by ethical, political, spiritual commitments. But in this case, they vied for a conservative interpretation of Islam because they thought that this is the way to assert their dignity, their sense of self, self-respect, and Puritan way of living, but in purely reactionary formation. So they didn't have, and again, I'm speaking from the position of privilege, right? The opportunity to decolonize, to sit down and engage in abolitionist understandings of Islam, to get to know themselves and their traditions again. I mean, obviously, there's no going back to the time of the Prophet or Moses or Jesus or 1492. But what we want to extract are the ethical, political, spiritual commitments and begin to deploy them in the present. So, if I understand your question correctly, it requires our taking of a pause and actually rethinking, because this is why who we are. This is why Fanon had said decolonization is inherently violent act. Violent not at the level of just tactics or defense or self-defense, but at the level of the crisis of the self, the double consciousness that Du Bois had spoken about, figuring ourselves out, not only in relationship to who we are, me in relationship to Islam, but mean relationship to other people, given Arab supremacy, given anti-blackness. I'm an Egyptian, right? Or was born in Egypt. Well, Egypt, thrives on its construction. Arabs now thrive, particularly in the context of Egypt, on disavowing their Nubian sort of lineages and descendants and constructing ourselves as the whites of the Middle East, right? But this becomes, and of course, there's the elements of queerophobia and so on and so forth, because of, again, the disruption of our relationship to land as people of color, and masculinities and femininities that are tied to the private and the public, and again, our movement and our spaces. And so with all these assaults that are happening given this condition of war that we've been born into, it's very challenging, because the inclination is to simply, say, well, I'm an immigrant here. I just want to be a part of the dream. I just want to live, right? I just want to survive. I just want to make ends meet. But this is where community becomes important. This is where the experience of the Panthers is Ashanti, becomes, insofar as organization. We're even far away from that. And this was the potential that these encampments, in a certain sense, offered a different world where different people, different formations may walk with one another, not on one another, may walk with the land and allow the land to teach them something, because she's a spiritual subject that has much to answer or much to teach us beyond historical material analysis that doesn't account for metaphysics. I mean, and this is the land that produces the air that we breathe, the very thamarat, or seeds that blossom into fruits and vegetables. I mean, I shudder to think that Muslims, we sit down and read the Quran, right? And so many chapters in the Quran are named after non-human life. The chapter of the bees, the chapter of the sun, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the thunder. But we don't sit down and reflect on the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in teaching us all this. So I think it also requires that we think and go beyond identity politics. As I always say, it doesn't matter to me if somebody comes and introduces themselves as a Muslim, or as they're queer, or they're Black, or they're Indigenous. I mean, you could be Muslim and Zionist. There are plenty of those nowadays. So what are the ethical, political, spiritual commitments that inform one's identities? I think that's what the coming formations and communities need to contend with. And here, it's contending with the fact that there is no liberation in Palestine at all, and it's a pipe dream. America's leading this war, crusading America's leading this war, without the assertion of Indigenous sovereignty and Black self-determination. And particularly Indigenous sovereignty that tends to be neglected because of how US history constructs itself from 1619 onwards. The original sin is masked, and Indigenous people are regarded as like signposts to history, unless their names are on, football teams like the Washington Redskins or the Chiefs, or their names are on weapons of mass destruction like Tomahawk missiles and Apache helicopters. So,
Sorry, go ahead, Kalonji.
No. I wanted to bring Ashanti into the game, because one of the things that Mohamed spoke on was Indigenous sovereignty and Black self-determination. And I think that's important, because that's part of the actual title of this particular program. I wanted to ask Ashanti. Ashanti, you good? You there? Look like he might be.
Is he frozen?
It looked like he might be frozen again. So I'll pose this question to Mohamed.
But I would also maybe add a little bit before we go back to Mohamed, right? I was at a conference in New Haven. It's called Imagination and Incarceration. And there was a person on the panel who said, we don't need prayer. And then I was listening to them. This is connected to Ashanti, because then I started realizing that, Duru bin Wahad, Jihad Moment, like Kamal Sadiq. I was like, wait, there's so many Muslim names, Asada Shakur. So the notion of prayer has been so Christianized, even if the person might have been Jewish, right? Or it's so Americanized that they didn't see how people who were deeply invested in the struggle, such as Ashanti and others, like Jihad was speaking last night on a platform with Ryan Napoli, right? Talking about the need to, I understand there's a difference between resistance and mobilization. But when I saw Ashanti about a month or so ago speak at Brown University, he was saying very important things about agency, and also going back to, the murder of George Floyd. The question is, why didn't somebody throw a cell phone? Like, we're capturing the torture, we're re-narrating the torture and the death. But again, I'm coming back to what everybody's put on the table. What is our spiritual stability, where we can learn from the Panthers and the people who went underground, understanding, there's contradictions everywhere. But how is it? I don't know. Is Ashanti back yet? Not yet.
No, he's not back, but I like how you sack my question, just ball my question up and toss it in the
No,
trash
no,
can.
it's no.
Like I ain't even had no question.
I thought you had.
I'm just messing you. Go ahead.
I
Go
thought I
ahead.
was expanding on your. I'm sorry. I'm making stuff up right now, so forgive me.
It's all
So,
good.
but no, because my brain's on fire, because there's like this weave. So like Ashanti did decades, like Sekou, like, to go to prison for all those years based on principle and what I will call revolutionary love. How is it that those of us who cannot or will not engage on that level can comprehend? Does that make sense? And I don't think I stole from you, Kalonji, or pushed you aside. I was like,
I'm just messing with you, man. Don't take it personal.
okay, all right,
Jeez.
all right,
Jeez, I'm sorry.
just
Go ahead.
checking, so yeah, I don't have the answer, but this is the thing. Like, when I go places and I talk, people sometimes mock spirituality. But when I think of the people who went underground, I call it the hypocenter, versus the people on the epicenter, on the surface of politics, even when they're being good people. I see the spirituality in the people who take the risk. And like Mohammed, you took risks too, and so did the students at Columbia and the students at Brown, all the students who got arrested, who got brutalized by the NYPD, the students who got jacked up at UCLA, not just by cops, but also they're letting these white nationalists, roll up on campus, and nobody's arresting them for their brutality, right? So this version of like the Klan would be doing in the 1950s and 1960s to stop the civil rights movement, we have their like grandkids doing it as adult people today. So back to spirit. If our revolutionaries carry spirit, we all do to some degree. How is it that we recognize what they carry when we are afraid or cannot do what they do? And that could be for Kalanji and Mohammed.
No,
Kalonji,
no. I agree with that question. And I was just talking trash. I'm all for that. That's one of the grand arguments we have on this platform: the necessity of spirituality when it comes to revolution. I don't myself. Maybe I'm not as revolutionary as a lot of people, but for me, it's the mental, physical, and the spiritual that really it's the spiritual side, I think, that has motivated so many of our freedom fighters. To Joy's point, so many of the freedom fighters that I know are primarily Muslim, or they come out of Ifa or indigenous African spirituality. So for me, I hear folks all the time saying, they indeed, like you said, Joy, they mock spirituality. And again, we understand, your disdain for religion, but when it comes to spirituality, it's like saying that I don't need my brain, to think. I don't need my mind. So I'm kind of confused with that. So no, I agree with you, but I would love to hear Muhammad's take. And I think that Ashanti's back like he never left. What's happening, Ashanti? You good now?
I am, if you can hear me.
We can hear you. You look like you in the movie Frozen, but we hear you pretty good. And Joy speaking, she got her mic on mute, so it's like we see your face, we see
Okay.
Joy face moving,
Okay, I
and your voice.
was so animated. I'm sorry. I'm being the dominant personality among the four of us right now. So it's okay. Like, everybody relax. So Shante, I mentioned, I don't know if you heard me, I was talking about when I saw you in Providence, and when you were saying, the whole somebody throw a cell phone, but also the
Right.
way in which I've been on panels where they mock Like, I don't feel people understand the revolutionaries because they don't understand the role of Islam or the role of indigenous African religions. I'm repeating what Kalonji said, that motivate people and keep them faithful to people.
Right.
Still there, Ashanti?
Well, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think, Joy, I think some of that is generational. You can hear me, Kalonji?
Yes, sir. We hear you.
No, am I freezing again?
No, we can hear you. It's just, don't worry about your face. You know what I'm saying? It's
Okay.
just
I
we can
think
hear your voice though.
some of that is generational. It was like I got some of my comrades from back in them days. All days I feel, and we go at it sometimes, are stuck back in the ideologies and stuff that was so scientific that if it wasn't big as science, Marxism, Leninism, and all the other isms, if it wasn't that guiding it, it didn't have much to do with other things. Forgetting the fact that we are humans, we're much bigger than science, the sciences. That you have to deal with human beings on a very multidimensional level. Just like that one, that what you were just saying, the one who said, what do we need to be praying about in so many words? I'm like, and that's one of my comrades. And it's coming to an understanding that we, not only just being an African people, we're a spiritual people, but just people. You can't just deal with us as just real. You can't just deal with a class analysis. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Muhammad's book, because it brings in more of a holistic perspective on
Ashanti, turn your camera off.
revolution.
Ashanti, turn your camera off. It may help help the stream. So let's just use the audio because I think the camera is
that we have to bring all of us in. You ain't got to become. You ain't got to become this or that. But it really would help us to understand what's going on in Palestine, which is majority Muslim.
so Ashanti, if you could,
but when that
I don't think you hear me.
struggle does conclude at some point, and hopefully it will conclude in their liberation, here we come back home and we have to still issues here going forward. If it goes again with camera
So Ashanti,
off.
yeah, if you could turn your camera off, that might help a little bit. Yeah, because it's like you sounding like like you underwater or something. I'm gonna take you off the screen for a second and just turn your camera off. Okay, so if you don't mind, Mohammed, continue with give us your version while Ashanti works on his camera. We'll take it from there if that's all right. We apologize to the viewers. Sometimes we have connection issues. We're tuning in from 4 different locations. So for folks that sometimes people complain, they like, oh man, this, that. If you want to donate to internet funds, we'll make sure that folks get what they need. Mohammed, what's your take on spirituality's role in liberation movement?
Has Marxism not become a religion? Anarchism not a religion? Capitalism has its own religion. The state has its own religion, right? Again, and God we trust on the dollar bill, whatever. promise to protect against all enemies, foreign and domestic, you're pledging allegiance to a sovereign. You're swearing by a sovereign, and you can't pledge allegiance to two sovereigns, simultaneously at the same time. I was listening to these conservatives recently talking about how Americans should just be Americans, right? In the sense that they shouldn't hold dual passports or citizenships, because that puts them at odds insofar as their pledges of allegiance. So who are we pledging allegiance to? To principles that God, you could call God Yahweh, Mother Earth, Buddha, Isa. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant to them. But the covenant that one holds with a sovereign, that becomes the question. And let me frame it another way: how can one love without spirit? Because it also assumes this calculus, right, or dialectical materialism, historical materialism, right? It assumes the surgical narrative where it's 1, 2, 3, and we've got it all figured out. Insofar as our species, that we have crowned ourselves as God, and that revolution is just a series of steps that we need to participate in order to. Again, what does the cosmos? What does our Earth? That ultimately is above everything else, because our Mother Earth doesn't need us. We need her. We're at the bottom of the pyramid, as opposed to, again, our construction is at the very top. But this assumption that we don't need metaphysics, that we don't need cosmology, is part of our arrogance, that we assume that we have nothing to learn from the universe, and the calculability of it all. Well, if that's the case, then why haven't we institutionalized or instituted some kind of change? Where is the sense of modesty, of humility that becomes necessary, in my humble opinion, for a revolutionary? In fact, it's one of the most defining, important characteristics. And a sense of also accountability, right, to a higher principle, a higher sense of community, a higher level of justice and judgment, adjudication. So what, Hitler, just by offing himself, that's it? George Bush, there is no accountability insofar as, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Madeleine Albright, and the architect of the oil for food program that killed over 1 million Iraqi children. So what? They just die and that's it. So where's the role in that? And I understand the impulse to. Human beings like to control, right? I mean, we become so incessant in the sense that unless we can see it, unless we can define it, but that's part of the European gaze, the white man's gaze, that and unless it is categorizable, subject to discipline, subject to something that we control, then it must not hold true. And I think that is part of the guise that needs penetrating in a certain sense. And people that even
I
take
think
it
I
from
got a
another.
bad connection.
Even from the perspective of those on the other end. I mean, the United Arab Emirates and the Arabian Gulf Peninsula countries are actually conscripting Muslim scholars in the West, like Hamza Yusuf, a white revert, in order to make the argument for the legitimacy of the Abraham Accords. He's throwing Palestinians. So regardless of, even if you don't believe in God, that's okay, fine. Right? This is why I said it's the faith or the lack of faith. Okay. But that becomes part of the revolutionary equation, because it's part of the propagandist tools that the other side is using, like it or not. So how are you responding to that? This was my problem during the so-called Arab Spring. You want to be a revolutionary, you got to know your audience. Okay, the predominant majority of your audience in the case of Egypt were Muslim. And yes, the Muslim Brotherhood had committed atrocities towards Coptic Christians. Coptic Christians have internalized Islamophobia. Even Muslims have internalized Islamophobia. But you got to know your audience. And there's nothing that's going to be as palpable a force. We talk about Palestine, right? What gives Palestinians their sense of sumud, their sense of resilience, despite everything that they have gone through? I mean, and this is what, people are talking about, the mass conversion, reversion sort of rates that are happening in the US. I mean, it's sort of like a post 9/11 moment. To me, my concern is, what Islam are you converting or reverting to? Is it a conservative Islam or a liberal Islam, or what kind of Islam? I mean, that becomes more important, because again, it's not a matter of numbers. As the Prophet, peace be upon him, had said, near the end of times, Muslims will be as many as the foam and the oceans of the wave, but they will be fickle and feeble as that wave when it crashes into the rocks. So it's not a matter of numbers. The Panthers weren't large in numbers. The Zapatistas aren't large in numbers. The Quran says, how many of a small group defeated a larger enemy? But that becomes the element of conviction, right? That needs to be embodied. So to go back to not only the question of spirituality, Kalonji, but also what you were, if I understand correctly, gesturing towards, Dr. James, which is, how do we organize in such a way to take up a certain, or to establish a certain stability? And I think it's going to be the shift again from mobilization to organization. What I mean by that, just to be clear, right now we have these direct actions, these mass mobilizations, which are far less than the Iraq War, that anti-war protests that never stopped the Iraq War. Tahrir, again, it's not a matter of numbers, right? And we have conservative Muslims that are against critical race theory and feminism and queerness. And right next to them, we got queers of all strands and stripes, and anti-Zionist Jews. And right next to them, an Islamophobic and anti-spiritual left. And everybody's yelling, free, free Palestine. Nobody's talking about, and they're all projecting their ideological specters onto what a free Palestine is supposed to be, without talking about the differences between them, because there is no left, and the left eats each other apart. Marxists versus anarchists versus I don't know who, and so on and so forth. There is no ethics of disagreement or conflict resolution mechanism, or an ethics of hospitality by which we get to know one another, because that's where trust is built. We're able to, again, engage in that, what is an inherent violence to the self in us getting to know one another. Again, vis-a-vis the stereotypes that we've internalized of one another. So there isn't organization at that level. We aren't breaking bread. We aren't looking each other eye to eye. We aren't building with one another, and we aren't establishing a sense of community. And I think that is a inherently spiritual act, religion or not, because it involves an investment in an other spirit, in an other's cosmology, worldview, and being open to the fact that one will be altered, one will change. The process of meeting somebody is also a process. I mean, it's a beautiful moment, knowing somebody's name, that is to be offered and not to be solicited or interrogated that way. But it's a spiritual moment, because anything can attract or repel two people. A scent, a look, a gesture, a word, unintended. And I always believe that there's an outside spirit that brings two souls together, right? And binds them together. And out of an appreciation of that, it also becomes a moment of mourning that at some point I or the other is going to die. There isn't a human being that has been created on this earth that has not passed away at some point or another. But it's then recognizing the feebleness, the fragility, the finiteness of life that is endowed with a certain spirited camaraderie, kinship, and that's what demands the kind of investment. So yeah, to me, that's the question of spirituality.
So as you talk about spirituality and you speak on community, right? I want to bring it up to speed. Again, Colombia, like over 50 other university encampments that's going on here in the United States, and then another couple dozen going on around the world. It seems like some form of community, right? Even if it's not the community that we envision. With that, as we started the conversation off, you've been one of many professors who has been attacked. President Shafiq, who was who came in, if I'm not mistaken, he became president a month or so after you was hired, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Shafiq was hired, I believe she began her tenure last September. I
Okay.
was hired in May of last year.
Okay.
I started in January, but I was hired last May, which is
Right.
something she lied about. So
Okay. So yeah. So she lied about that, and she also she took part of your tweets. Her and was it Stefanik? Um, and they had this convo and made you look like you were just some pro Hamas uh, lunatic, and like you just came through and you're like burn it all down and so on and so forth, and you rejected her deposit.
hmm.
Why? I mean, what is the how did that come about? Number one, why do you think she lied and willingly lied? Because she said that you were no longer employed at Columbia University, and she said that you would never be hired again. You would never work there at the university. So, I wanted to know why do you think it is that she just told a bold faced lie? Number one, but also before we got on, you talked about how folks were noticing you in the street, Zionists, and calling you all types of names, so on and so forth, and there's the death threat, so on and so forth. So, if you don't mind sharing that with the audience, because of course the we get the spiritual part, which is necessary, but for folks who are still in doubt, let's bring it home and let's talk about what's going on physically right now.
So thank you for your questions. Now, there are two parts to this, right? Again, going back to the question of um, why is it being targeted? I believe Manouche it wasn't the fact that she was just blacklisting me universally in terms of a job that I'm an expert as and I was hired for. I was hired to be an interdisciplinary scholar. I was teaching a course on queer and feminist BIPOC traditions from abolitionist and decolonial perspectives. But I was hired also because of my organizing background with the Zapatistas, the post-Seattle anti-globalization movements, the anti-war protests, the Tahrir, to expose the students to actual social movement organizing. And what that means from a social movement lens. Theory is a revolutionary praxis, as Bell Hooks, the late Bell Hooks, used to say, or says. So there were the skill sets that brought me here from land grab Zionist Cornell. And I think it is that and the fact that faculty and students were actively lobbying to have me stay after my tenure. My contract ends in May 30th. So she lied, as you noted, with regards to my being terminated. But to lobby to have me stay underneath another position, given the fact that, hey, I can teach in gender studies, I can teach in Middle Eastern, African and South Asian studies, I can teach in a myriad of different, my work has to deal with Indigenous studies, with Black studies. I work on political theology. So there's a lot, over 50 students had signed a petition, a letter that they had wrote and taken the initiative to write to the chair of the department, asking for the course to be offered next year. So these were active efforts. And of course, they didn't like the fact that I was very much involved with the students in terms of their organizing on the ground, or at least mobilizing at the time. And the right picked up on that. They picked up on the fact that, I was at the encampments. I was the first professor, and I think the only professor that actually actively taught inside the encampment. And they were, losing their minds. Is he terminated or not? We're seeing him at the encampment. Of course, I've been photographed unbeknown, walking into the building or my office building, speaking to you from my office right now, let alone to the encampments. I was never terminated. My entry onto campus was never revoked. But I've also had folks like conservatives like David Rubin put out a YouTube, and they're picking up what the left isn't picking up insofar as the imminent threat that I ostensibly pose insofar as I noted, calling out the American dream, because David Rubin comes about and says, "Oh, he's arguing for indigenous rights. Actually, I'm arguing for indigenous sovereignty." And he goes out and says something lunatic, as the fact that I guess that Mohamed Abdou would be okay with a Native American walking inside his building and blowing it up. Some crazy. It's quite surreal. His video is available online. He's got 2.4 million followers. My point being that him, others, Stefanik attacking me online, but also others going through my CUNY for Palestine event. Oh, he speaks in spoken word poetry. Oh, he's talking about Black self-determination. They're clearly understanding, although they're misconstruing, that what I'm after is not only a project of resistance, but a project of liberation. Hamas and Hezbollah are not liberatory to me, but a project that is anchored in genuine liberation. And they fail to understand that liberation, as decolonization is abolition, is not about destruction. It's about creation of a pluralist world, a world of many worlds, a world of the below for the poor, for the dispossessed, for the elderly, for children, for queer and gender dissidents, an anti-authoritarian world, a non-authoritarian world, a non-capitalist world. Revolutions involve practical questions that way, the transformation of ourselves, the greater jihad, the combat against our inner microfascisms. Because, to put it into plain words, what are you going to do when you get sick? These are the questions. What are you going to do with the army, with the police? What are you going to do when, somebody gets hungry? This is what revolutions involve. What are you creating in terms of an alternative? And that's what the left lacks. It doesn't create alternatives in so many ways. It wants to dismantle whatever exists, which is us an investment in the settler colonial order. But what if we divest from it? The Panthers didn't try and change things within. They just created the breakfast programs. They took over their neighborhoods, started to organize that way. The Zapatistas, they emerged on the scene 10 years after they had been preparing alternative schools, ways conceiving of healing, food sovereignty, and so on. And then they emerged on the scene December 21st, 1994. So it's for these reasons, I guess, that I'm constituted as sort of a public enemy. And so far as to the death threats, and so far as, people recognize me on the street. I was just walking with a friend, Maura Finkelstein, actually, this morning, meeting her for the first time. And somebody that was sitting down outside, on a patio, just yelled out, "Dr. Abdu, you suck." Right, but that's the least of it. I'm getting emails that are saying, you're lucky that you're standing upright. We know who you are. We know where you are. But look, to bring it back to the encampments and the possibilities, because these students, they allowed us to dream dangerously, right? And I think that these youth allowed that, and that's their inspiration. The way that created safe spaces, and safe spaces that had sort of conditions and rules: no drugs, no alcohol, no sexual harassment. They had a public library, they had a clinic, a medic center. Prayer was a part of it, community was a part of it, festivity was a part of it. They learned how to mourn death, how to celebrate life. And what they were against, and what these encampments are against, we at UCLA or otherwise, just so that it's very clear, I think it's clear to us, is that they aren't just combating a board of trustees. They are just combating Columbia University, that's a badly managed real estate corporation with investments in, Amazon and Heiko and a bunch of, in Lockheed Martin, dual degree programs in Tel Aviv. They're doing something more than that. They're against the settler state. And this is beyond the new McCarthyism, because, again, Islamophobia is at the heart of local as well as foreign policy, and we could maybe touch on that near the end, just to bring it back to where we began. Students have been exposed to microwave hearing LRAD weapons that are used to suppress dissent. They've been exposed to eviction. They're exposed to jail. They've been exposed to suspension. And they had to be suspended in order for the police to come into campus, and a police that was called twice. And again, what they did insofar as Hens Hall had happened on 4 separate different occasions, insofar as taking over what was referred to as Hamilton Hall. But then you got, sort of to bring it down back to Cop City, and Joy speaking about that at the beginning. We had Eric Adams, this Pinocchio that's who's only second to Donald Trump and in his wanton mendacity, and who wants to retire in Israel, being called in And the NYPD arrests over 300 students, close to 2,500 nationally. Eric Adams claimed that the students were radicalized. And of course, there's nothing illegal about being radicalized. This is the irony, right? So he wants to suppress, right, First Amendment rights. But okay, let's put that aside. He refers to the students as being influenced by professional outside agitators, which is a racist discourse, as we know, right? It's a racist term that emerges out of the Jim Crow era and civil rights movement activists and someone being labeled as such. We have NYPD Chief of Patrol John Chill, who was central in the planning and the execution of both raids at Columbia, right? Who actually murdered Ortazanso Bavel in 2008. He shot him in the back. And now mistakenly, he fired his gun while they were retaking Hinds Hall. Like, a student could have been killed. One of our kids could have been killed. And they do it all the time. And the madness about this moment, if I may say, is that, and again, I don't mean to abstract, but it's going in and out, right? The global, the local. It's just like, not too long ago, we were at the Arab Spring. Not too long ago, then we moved to Occupy what exactly we were talking about, stolen land. Then we talked about we were at No Dakota. Then we were talking about the Black Spring, or we're living the Black Spring, as Robin DJ Kelly, and now we've moved on to Palestine, and there's a genocide on the Congo, and we're scrolling through genocide vis-a-vis phones mined from another genocide of copper and cobalt in the Congo. And what, there are no Trayvon Martins, Michael Browns, George Floyds, Breonna Taylors happening right now? I mean, what links these struggles together? But this becomes sort of the importance of a narrative that binds our struggles together, from a spiritual, from a political, from an ethical. But to go back to this circus, and I'm sorry to call it that, in which, again, a student could have been killed. We have hilarious top NYPD Deputy Commissioner Daughtry holding a book titled An Introduction to Terrorism online, and this NYPD is releasing these, videos, sophisticated videos, to prove, how successful the raid was. And they don't identify that, number one, the Introduction to Terrorism was actually it's a book written by renowned historian Charles Townsend, and is it a guide to terrorism, right? We had them showing bike chains on national television, right, that students had used. And these bike chains, you could just buy them from public safety. And again, Hamilton Hall was it's a significant site because it's been a site of student protests in 68 and 72, during the anti-Vietnam War protests in 85, protests against South African apartheid and calls for divestments, and in 1996, when the students pulled off a hunger strike, demanding that there be a Department of Ethnic Studies. So it isn't, this new thing, but here we have, again, kids being exposed to tear gas, flash bombs, batons, and this crackdown that is also led and facilitated by Rebecca Weiner. And who's Rebecca Weiner? She's a Columbia professor who leads the NYPD unit division that maintains an office at Tel Aviv, right? Because she thinks that student rhetoric is terroristic, right? And we had the NYPD literally on campus, and it's not like BIPOC people, our bodies are safe with them on campus. We all know that. But also accounts of them engaging in sexual assault, while faculty are not and were not forbidden, and were forbidden from campus up until a few days ago. Students were forbidden from campus. I think they're actually forbidden from campus till today, because today's the last day in which the NYPD are required to be on campus. And the messaging is one and the same. I mean, the Washington Post wrote an article yesterday divulging, and this is the confluence again of sort of racial capitalism, of settler security states, in which it was out, in which Adams was outed insofar as there were actually WhatsApp chat groups amongst some of the nation's most prominent billionaires and financial leaders. With Adams, they included CEO of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, Dell founder and CEO Michael Dell, hedge fund manager Bill Ackman, and Joshua Kushner, the brother of, the founder of Thrive Capital and brother to Jared Kushner, the Donald Trump's son-in-law, actually having chats with Adams about how these protests need to be ended, how should be enforced.
Yeah, but thank you for that. I mean, because it just emphasizes the fact that the state as we know it is militarizing itself to protect capital. And this is what we were trying collectively, Kalonji included and others, right, around COP cities, that, you know, the billionaires are funding in some ways a private army, that Eric Adams, you may vote for him because he's African American and you think that's a good look, but the function is what we care about. It's not the identity. And that sort of brings me back like to the whole captive maternal thing. It's really about the function, right? And so that Columbia University would have a professor adjunct or whatever who does counterterrorism and also trains with IDF and then designates the students as proto-terrorists or terrorists in the making. That is their propaganda machine, as you pointed out. So, but I want to link it again to what Kalonji said, and it's nothing that we could map out here in this moment, but the security apparatus for protesters, right, is imperative. And so however we build that in terms of concentric circles, I remember when I went to Atlanta and met with some of the people who had been in the forest and they knew Tortuguita, and I asked them, what is your security apparatus? And this is also in the book because we transcribed, you know, some of our conversations. That could not be articulated, not because it wasn't supposed to be known to the public. It was because the security apparatus was not in place. And so when we go back and we talk about the Panthers, not in romantic or iconic, or I was a Panther, I should have been a Panther, whatever people are doing with this stuff, I don't know, don't care. But the function they had was feeding people, educating, etc., but they also provided security. That's why the original title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And it feels to me that our narrative that we have the right to defend ourselves, back to Malcolm, by any means necessary, right? This is how you get Mabel and Robert Williams, the couple who have to flee because the FBI, you know, persecutes them. They go to Cuba, they end up in China. You know, Williams gets Mao to write something that says Black people have the right to self-defense. Muslims have we all have a right to self-defense. The thing, I am probably getting more agitated, we're paying our tax money, right, for the salaries and the pensions of the people who are harming us because we want to stop a genocide and stop billionaire ballers like from determining all outcomes of social and economic life. But how we think about the physical violence, and of course you've been under incredible pressure, psychological, emotional. I mean, it's a form of terrorism. I don't care what anybody else says it is. And it's orchestrated. So the gender thing is weird for me too. You know, yay women, yay feminism. How many women presidents have like rolled on humanitarians? That's all the students are at this moment. Like they're trying to live up to UN protocols and we don't do war crimes. It's just basic stuff of being human, civilized, whatever that means, right? And I think then if we balance the spirit with the security, we increase our capacity in terms of deterring or pushing back predators. And yes, America can be a predator just like NYPD, and they're not rogue. They're not rogue because this is the plan. As you said, they've been talking to these billionaires. And unfortunately, you know, you and I work in this industry that had all these platitudes about enlightenment and teaching students and caring about the world. But when you activate it, Mohamed, and like you said, you're teaching actually where the students are in the encampment, when you actually have the care and the love and the decency to be an educator who is not an opportunist or a coward, that's when they really want to, in different ways, delete and disappear you. And so our role is to resist and push back.
Real quick, I want to remind you, good folks, we are checking out Black Power Media. This is Guerrilla Intellectual University. We have about 3 minutes left, unfortunately. Okay. You know, so I want to move to invite you back on, Mohamed, because I think this is a very important convo. In an hour and a half, couldn't package it enough. Ashanti sends his love to the audience. He was having some technical difficulties, our brother Ashanti Alston out there, but I would like to definitely come back to this conversation We can line something up next week if possible. Check our calendars, our dates. But I think that this is a very important topic, and we really didn't even get to the meat of it, unfortunately. But it is definitely a Guerrilla Intellectual University moment. We want to thank Dr. Mohamed Abdou for joining us today. We want to thank our brother Ashanti Alston, and of course, my co-host Ryder Shotgun, Dr. Joy James.
And Kalonji, can I just add, we talked a lot about Columbia, but remember the CUNY students, the new school, like across the country, like it's not just the elites. There's, so many profs have been fired, pushed out, threatened, been blasted by reactionary press and the cops that work with reactionary press. So thank you for your service, Mohamed.
Yes.
I'm humbled. I'm deeply, I was given a talk at the new school. I was really astonished at the degree of like barricades and officers that knew I was coming. It's all round. And Dr. Joy, Dr. James, thank you so much for everything that you taught, that you continue to teach. The same thing for Ashanti. You're all my elders. Kalonji, I really look forward to meeting you. Thank you all for this opportunity. I really hope we can continue this conversation, particularly with violence as a tactic, and us building community and what that actually means on the ground together here and elsewhere, and asserting the means of our own autonomy. And I think that becomes really crucial when we're talking about the lands. And I think that's very important to contend with. We certainly don't own the I-4 Rust Belt corridor. It's the white farmer armed to the teeth with stamp decrees who feeds the metropolis. So what does that mean in terms of our self-sufficiency? What does it mean, again, when everybody's having to hyphenate their identity, the Native American, the African American, the Arab American, the I don't know what American, but the only American that doesn't have to do that is the white American, because they're assumed to be the native of the land.
And then particularly if they're in predatory formation and they're reactionary. That's their gold standard, is the abuse.
Yes, the native colonizers of the land. Again, you're checking out Black Power Media. For folks who are just tuning in, or if you're not just tuning in, make sure you subscribe. YouTube.com at Black Power Media Reloaded. YouTube.com at Black Power Media Reloaded. Also, make sure you tap into our email list, which can be, you can register or hop on our list at blackpowermedia.org. Blackpowermedia.org. Thank you both for your time and your service. And in the immortal words of our comrade turned ancestor, George Jackson, is war without terms. Till next time, Guerrilla Intellectual University, we are out.
Peace.
Peace.
Ancestor, ancestor, take my hand, ancestor, lead me on, ancestor, let me stand, ancestor, I get tired, ancestor, I get weak, my nose I get warm, ancestor, through the storm, ancestor, through the night, ancestor, lead me on, ancestor, through the light, ancestor, take my hand, ancestor.